I was barely halfway through my morning coffee when I saw Linda Hartwell marching across my lawn like she owned the place, clipboard in hand and that trademark scowl plastered across her face. As the deputy city manager for Riverside Springs, California, I had dealt with plenty of difficult people in my career, but Linda took the cake as the most insufferable HOA president our community had ever seen. "Victor Xander," she shouted before even reaching my front door. "I'm here on official HOA business." I sighed and set down my mug, walking to the door and opening it before she could start pounding. "Morning, Linda. What seems to be the problem?" She thrust her clipboard at me, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing at a list of supposed violations. "That's what the problem is. Your lawn is a quarter-inch too long according to HOA regulations. Your garbage cans were left out past 7 o'clock last Tuesday, and don't even get me started on that hideous garden gnome by your mailbox." I glanced at the gnome in question, a cheerful ceramic fellow that my late mother had given me years ago. "The gnome has been there for 3 years, Linda. Nobody has complained about it before." "Well, I'm complaining now." Her voice pitched higher, that signature Karren tone that made dogs howl 3 streets over. "As HOA president, it's my duty to maintain property values in Riverside Springs estates. I'm putting you on formal notice. You have 72 hours to correct these violations or face a $500 fine." I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was already connecting the dots. Linda had been on my case ever since I voted against her husband's construction company getting the contract for the new community center. That was 6 months ago, and apparently, she held grudges like some people collected stamps. "I'll take a look at your concerns," I said evenly. "You'll do more than look," she wagged that finger again. "I'm also filing a formal complaint with code enforcement. We'll see how you like dealing with the city on this matter." Now that was interesting. As deputy city manager, I oversaw several departments including code enforcement. The code enforcement officer, Marcus Chen, reported directly to me, but Linda didn't know that. Most residents had no idea what I actually did for work. I kept a low profile, preferring to keep my professional and personal lives separate. "You do what you feel is necessary," I said calmly. Linda's eyes narrowed. "Don't think you can sweet-talk your way out of this, Victor. Rules are rules, and I enforce them equally for everyone in this neighborhood." That was rich coming from someone who had installed a 8-foot privacy fence last year that was clearly 2 feet over the HOA's maximum height requirement. But I wasn't about to get into that argument on my doorstep at 7:30 in the morning. After she finally stomped away, I called my office and asked my assistant to pull Linda Hartwell's property file. Then I called Marcus Chen directly. "Morning, boss," Marcus answered cheerfully. He was a good guy, thorough and fair, which was exactly why I had hired him 2 years ago. "Marcus, heads up. You're probably going to get a complaint filed about my property today from one Linda Hartwell." There was a pause. "The HOA president? What's she claiming?" "Lawn height, garbage can placement, and an offensive garden gnome." Marcus laughed. "The gnome your mom gave you? That thing is adorable. Let me guess, she's on a power trip again?" "Seems that way. Do me a favor and handle this one by the book. I don't want any appearance of impropriety. Come out, measure everything, take photos, and document it properly." "Will do. Though between you and me, I drove past your place yesterday. Your lawn looks fine." "I know, but let's make sure everything is documented correctly." I spent the rest of the morning at City Hall dealing with budget meetings and planning commission hearings. My phone buzzed around 2 in the afternoon with a text from Marcus. "At your property now, everything checks out. Full report by end of day." When I got home that evening, I found a notice from the code enforcement office posted on my door visible to anyone walking by. Professional though it was, it still stung to have that bright orange paper announcing an inspection. I pulled it down and read Marcus's findings. As expected, everything was in compliance with actual city code. My lawn measured exactly 1.5 inches, well within the acceptable range. The garbage cans had been photographed in my garage, not on the street, and there was no municipal ordinance against garden gnomes of any variety. But the HOA notice Linda had left was a different matter. According to her interpretation of the rules, I was in violation of multiple covenants. The fine would be assessed in 72 hours unless I corrected the issues and provided photographic evidence. I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws and started reading. It had been a while since I had reviewed them, and what I found was enlightening. The bylaws stated that the HOA could not enforce any rule that contradicted local, state, or federal law. They also required a formal hearing process before any fine over $100 could be assessed. And most importantly, any rule enforcement had to be applied uniformly across all properties in the subdivision. I spent the next hour driving slowly through Riverside Springs estates with my phone, documenting everything. By the time I was done, I had photos of at least 15 properties with violations more egregious than anything Linda had accused me of. The Petersons had a commercial boat parked in their driveway, which was explicitly forbidden. The Chavez family had painted their house a shade of yellow that wasn't on the approved color list, and the Hartwells themselves had that oversized fence, plus a basketball hoop mounted on the street side of their property, which was also against the rules. The next morning, Linda was back, this time with 2 other HOA board members in tow. Patricia Monroe and Susan Whitley flanked her like backup singers, both wearing matching disapproving expressions. "Have you corrected your violations?" Linda demanded without preamble. "I haven't violated anything," I replied calmly. "Code enforcement inspected the property yesterday. Everything is in full compliance with city ordinances." Linda's face reddened. "I don't care what code enforcement says. The HOA has its own rules and you're breaking them." Actually, according to Section 3 of our bylaws, the HOA cannot enforce rules that contradict municipal code. Since code enforcement found no violations, there's nothing to correct. "That's not how this works," Linda sputtered. "That's exactly how it works. I have a copy of the bylaws right here if you'd like to review them." Patricia spoke up for the first time, her voice slightly less aggressive than Linda's. "The HOA board has the authority to interpret the covenants as we see fit. We're voting to assess the $500 fine, then I'll be requesting a formal hearing, as is my right under Section 7. I'll also be presenting evidence that the enforcement is being applied discriminatorily, which violates Section 12. Susan's eyes widened slightly. "Discriminatorily? That's a serious accusation." I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the photos I had taken. I have documented evidence of 15 other properties in violation of various covenants, some much more seriously than the alleged violations at my property, yet I don't see any notices posted on their doors. That's selective enforcement which the bylaws explicitly prohibit. Linda snatched at my phone, but I pulled it back smoothly. "Don't touch my property, Linda. If you want copies of this documentation, I'll be happy to present it at the formal hearing." "There won't be any hearing," Linda snapped. "The fine is assessed and you'll pay it." "No, I won't. And if you continue to harass me, I'll file a complaint with the California Department of Real Estate." "HOAs are regulated entities, Linda. You can't just make up rules as you go." That finally seemed to get through to Susan and Patricia. They exchanged glances, and I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. Linda, however, was beyond reason. "We'll see about that. I'm escalating this to the city. I'm going straight to the city manager's office, and we'll have code enforcement back out here with real teeth." "Good luck with that," I said, closing my door. I actually felt a little bad about what was going to happen next. But Linda had brought this entirely on herself. The following morning I was in my office at City Hall when my assistant buzzed me. "Mr. Xander, there's a Linda Hartwell here demanding to see someone about a code enforcement matter. She says it's urgent. Send her to Marcus Chen's office. And let Marcus know I'd like to sit in on the meeting." 10 minutes later, I walked into Marcus's office to find Linda mid-rant. She was gesturing wildly, her voice echoing down the hallway. "And this resident thinks he's above the rules just because code enforcement gave him a pass. I want a supervisor involved. I want someone with actual authority to handle this." Marcus, to his credit, looked completely professional. "Madam, I assure you, my instruction was thorough and by the book. But you're in luck. My supervisor is here now." Linda spun around, and her face went from red to white to purple in rapid succession when she saw me standing in the doorway. "Victor?" she stammered. "That would be Deputy City Manager Xander," Marcus said smoothly. "He oversees the code enforcement department, among others." I walked into the office and took a seat. "Ms. Hartwell, I understand you have concerns about the code enforcement inspection conducted at my property?" Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This is a conflict of interest. Actually, that's exactly why I had Marcus handle the inspection personally and document everything meticulously. I wanted to make sure there was no appearance of impropriety. "Marcus, can you walk Ms. Hartwell through your findings?" Marcus pulled up his report on his computer and turned the monitor so Linda could see it. "The property at 428 Maple Grove Drive was inspected on Tuesday at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. Lawn height measured between 1.3 and 1.6 inches at various points, well within the city ordinance maximum of 3 inches. No garbage receptacles were present at the street or visible from the public right-of-way. All decorative elements, including the garden gnome in question, are on private property and do not violate any city ordinance regarding height, placement, or aesthetic standards." Linda found her voice again. "But the HOA rules are more strict than city code." "That's between you and the HOA," Marcus said. "Code enforcement only has jurisdiction over municipal ordinances. If your HOA wants to enforce stricter standards, that's a civil matter between the HOA and the homeowner." "But I wanted you to cite him." I leaned forward. "Let me be clear, Ms. Hartwell. Code enforcement serves the entire city of Riverside Springs. We enforce actual laws and ordinances designed to protect health, safety, and welfare. We are not a tool for HOA presidents to settle personal vendettas. If you attempt to weaponize city resources for personal disputes again, I'll have no choice but to document it formally." Linda stood up so fast her chair rolled back and hit the wall. "This is outrageous. I'm going to complain to the city manager." "That's your right," I said calmly. "Richard Torres is on the 3rd floor. I'll let him know you're coming." She stormed out, and Marcus let out a low whistle. "That woman is something else. You have no idea. Document this entire interaction, please. I have a feeling this isn't over." I went upstairs to Richard's office. As city manager, he was technically my boss, though we had a good working relationship built on mutual respect. I filled him in on the situation before Linda could get there. Richard listened carefully, then shook his head. "Some people never learn. Don't worry about it, Vic. If she comes up here making wild accusations, I'll handle it." Linda did indeed show up, and I could hear her raised voice from my office 1 floor down. The meeting lasted about 15 minutes before she came storming out of City Hall entirely. That evening I received an email from the HOA's attorney, a firm called Morrison & Associates based in Sacramento. The email was professional but firm, demanding that I pay the $500 fine within 30 days or face a lien on my property. Now it was getting interesting. I forwarded the email to my own attorney, Thomas Whitmore, who had handled my mother's estate and various other legal matters over the years. Tom called me within an hour. "Vic, they don't have a leg to stand on. Based on what you've told me and the documentation you've gathered, this is selective enforcement at its finest. Want me to draft a response? Please. And Tom, I want to request that formal hearing I'm entitled to under the bylaws. Let's put everything on the record. You got it. This is going to be fun." Tom's response letter was a masterpiece. It outlined every legal deficiency in the HOA's case, cited relevant California statutes about HOA governance, and included a detailed list of the other properties in violation that the HOA was ignoring. It also formally requested a hearing within 30 days as required by the bylaws, and put the board on notice that any attempt to place a lien without following proper procedures would result in immediate legal action. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later to be held at the community center in Riverside Springs Estates. In the meantime, something interesting started happening. Other homeowners began reaching out to me. First was David Park, who lived 2 streets over. "Hey Victor, I heard through the grapevine that you're fighting back against Linda. Mind if I ask you some questions? She fined me $2,000 last year for building a deck without HOA approval, even though I had all the city permits." Then came Maria Rodriguez. "Linda made me remove my rose bushes because she said they were too tall, but they were my grandmother's roses planted 30 years ago. I didn't know I could fight back." Soon I was fielding calls and messages from nearly a dozen homeowners, all with stories of Linda's overzealous and often contradictory enforcement of HOA rules. The picture that emerged was troubling. Linda wasn't just on a power trip with me. She had been systematically targeting specific homeowners while giving others, particularly her friends, a complete pass on violations. I compiled all of this information and passed it along to Tom. "This is bigger than just my case," I told him. "Linda has been abusing her authority for years." "Document everything," Tom advised. "And make sure these other homeowners are willing to go on record. We might be able to turn this hearing into something much more significant." The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over my presentation, making sure every fact was accurate and every piece of evidence was properly organized. This wasn't just about a garden gnome or lawn height anymore. This was about holding an out-of-control HOA board accountable. The community center was packed when I arrived. Apparently word had spread and at least 50 residents showed up, far more than the usual handful who attended HOA meetings. Linda sat at a table at the front with Patricia and Susan, looking irritated by the turnout. "This is supposed to be a formal hearing for one property matter," Linda announced. "I don't know why so many people are here. It's a public meeting of the HOA board," Tom Whitmore said, standing up. "Any resident has the right to attend. Shall we begin?" Linda glared at him but nodded. "Fine, we're here regarding the violations at 428 Maple Grove Drive, owned by Victor Xander. Mr. Xander has failed to comply with 3 separate covenant violations and has refused to pay the assessed fine. The board is prepared to place a lien on the property." Tom stood smoothly. "Before we proceed, I'd like to establish some facts. Ms. Hartwell, can you provide documentation showing that code enforcement cited my client's property for violations?" Linda shuffled papers. "Code enforcement is irrelevant. The HOA has its own standards. Actually, Section 3.2 of the bylaws states, and I quote, 'No covenant restriction shall be enforced that contradicts or exceeds the requirements of applicable federal, state, or local law.' Code enforcement found 0 violations of city ordinance. Therefore, any HOA enforcement must be for aesthetic standards only. Can you cite which specific aesthetic standard in the covenants my client violated?" Linda's face was reddening again. "His lawn was too long. The covenant states lawns must be maintained in a neat and tidy condition. Code enforcement measured the lawn at 1.3 to 1.6 inches. Is the board seriously arguing that a lawn under 2 inches tall is not neat and tidy? It looked shaggy, Linda insisted. Looked shaggy to whom? And by what objective standard? The covenant doesn't specify an exact height for lawn grass. City code allows up to 3 inches. My client's lawn was barely half that. Susan Whitley cleared her throat. What about the garbage can violation? Tom pulled out photos on his tablet and projected them onto the screen at the front of the room. These photos taken by code enforcement show my client's garbage cans stored in his garage. The violation notice claimed they were left at the street past 7 in the morning on a specific Tuesday. Does the board have any evidence to support that claim? Silence. And finally, the garden gnome. Can the board cite any covenant restriction on decorative lawn ornaments under 12 inches in height? Linda stood up, her voice rising. We don't need to justify every little decision. The board has the authority to make judgments about what maintains property values. Actually, you do need to justify your decisions, Tom said calmly, especially when those decisions result in significant financial penalties. But let's move on to a bigger issue. Section 12 of the bylaws prohibits selective enforcement. The board must apply covenant restrictions uniformly across all properties. I have documentation here of 15 other properties with violations that are significantly more serious than anything alleged against my client, yet none of those properties have received violation notices, let alone fines. Tom began displaying the photos I had taken. The boat in the Petersons' driveway, the Chavez family's non-approved house color, and finally the Hartwell's oversized fence and street-side basketball hoop. The room erupted in murmurs. Linda's face was now purple. Those are different situations. How so? Tom asked. The bylaws don't contain exceptions for different situations. Either everyone follows the rules, or the rules can't be enforced. You can't pick and choose based on personal preferences. Patricia Monroe was flipping through her own copy of the bylaws, and I could see the moment she realized Tom was right. She leaned over to whisper something to Susan, who also looked worried. But Linda wasn't backing down. I move that the board vote to uphold the fine and proceed with placing a lien on Mr. Xander's property. I second, Susan said quietly, though she looked uncomfortable. All in favor? Linda asked. Linda raised her hand. Susan raised hers halfway, then lowered it. Actually, I think we need to table this and consult with our attorney. We don't need an attorney, Linda snapped. All in favor? Only Linda's hand was up. Patricia and Susan both shook their heads. The motion fails, Patricia said. Linda, I think Susan's right. We need legal guidance before we proceed. I'm the president of this board and I say we vote. And I'm saying we need to follow proper procedures, Patricia said, her voice firm. This hearing is tabled pending legal review. Linda looked like she was about to explode. But before she could say anything else, David Park stood up from the audience. While we're all here, I'd like to raise a formal complaint against the HOA board for abuse of authority and selective enforcement. I was fined $2,000 last year for building a permitted deck, and I want that fine reviewed. Maria Rodriguez stood next. I want my case reviewed too. Linda made me remove plants that had been there for 30 years. One by one, other homeowners stood up with their own complaints. The meeting devolved into chaos, with Linda shouting that everyone was out of order while Patricia tried unsuccessfully to restore calm. Finally, Tom Whitmore raised his voice. May I make a suggestion? It seems clear that there are significant concerns about how the HOA has been managed. Under the bylaws, 20% of homeowners can petition for a special election to recall board members and elect new ones. I'd be happy to help any interested residents understand that process. Linda slammed her hand on the table. This meeting is adjourned. You can't adjourn a meeting that hasn't completed its agenda, Patricia said quietly. Linda, I think you need to step back and let Susan and me handle this. I'm the president, and you're letting personal feelings cloud your judgment, Patricia replied. I move to suspend tonight's proceedings and schedule a special board meeting next week to review all pending enforcement actions for compliance with the bylaws. We'll also be engaging outside legal counsel to provide an independent opinion.
I second,
Susan said quickly.
All in favor?
Patricia asked. Susan's hand went up immediately. After a long pause, even Linda raised her hand, though she looked like it physically pained her to do so. The meeting broke up shortly after, with small groups of homeowners clustering in the parking lot to discuss what had just happened. Several people came up to thank me for fighting back. You just did what the rest of us were too scared to do, David Park said, shaking my hand. That woman has been a nightmare for years. I drove home feeling vindicated but also exhausted. The battle was far from over, but at least the tide was turning. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Patricia Monroe called me personally to apologize for how the situation had been handled. I should have been paying closer attention, she admitted. Linda has been making decisions without consulting Susan and me, And when we did push back, she'd steamroll over us. Your case finally made us realize how out of control things had gotten. The HOA's attorney, after reviewing the evidence, sent a letter stating that the fine against my property was being rescinded. They also recommended a comprehensive audit of all enforcement actions taken in the past 2 years. But Linda wasn't done yet. She started a whisper campaign through the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen that I had used my position at City Hall to unfairly influence code enforcement, and that I was trying to destroy the HOA from the inside. Most people didn't buy it, but a few of Linda's close friends rallied to her defense. They started showing up at city council meetings during public comment, making vague accusations about corruption and conflicts of interest. Richard Torres finally pulled me into his office. "Vic, this is getting out of hand. These people are wasting the council's time, and it's starting to reflect badly on the city." "I know. I'm sorry you're getting dragged into this. Don't apologize. You haven't done anything wrong. But I think we need to address this head on. Would you be comfortable if I released a statement clarifying the code enforcement process and your role in it, if you think it would help?" Richard drafted a professional statement explaining that code enforcement operates independently in the field, that all inspections are documented and reviewable, and that I had specifically ensured extra documentation in my own case to avoid any appearance of impropriety. He also noted that attempting to weaponize city departments for personal disputes was inappropriate and wouldn't be tolerated. The statement didn't make Linda happy, but it did shut down most of the whispers. The few die-hard supporters she had left mostly went quiet after that. Meanwhile, a group of homeowners led by David Park and Maria Rodriguez began collecting signatures for a recall petition. They only needed 20% of residents to sign, and they hit that threshold in less than a week. A special election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Linda fought it tooth and nail. She sent out mass emails claiming the recall was illegal, that it was being orchestrated by people who wanted to destroy property values, and that I was manipulating everything from behind the scenes. But the more she fought, the more people signed on to the recall. The independent legal review of the HOA's enforcement actions came back, and it was damning. Out of 42 enforcement actions taken in the past 2 years, 34 showed evidence of selective enforcement or procedural violations. The attorney recommended reversing most of the fines and refunding money to homeowners who had already paid. Patricia and Susan voted to accept the attorney's recommendations over Linda's strenuous objections. Refund checks went out, totaling over $30,000. The HOA's reserves took a serious hit, but it was the right thing to do. As the recall election approached, Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started showing up at properties unannounced with a tape measure, trying to find new violations to cite. She sent out daily emails blasting the recall organizers, and she began filing complaints with every city department she could think of, trying to find something, anything that would stick. One morning, Marcus Chen called me with concern in his voice. "Boss, Linda Hartwell just filed a complaint claiming that David Park has unpermitted electrical work in his house. She says she saw him running new wiring through a window. Does David have permits?" "Already checked. He pulled permits 3 months ago for a complete electrical upgrade. Everything is up to code and signed off by our inspector." But here's the thing. Linda filed this complaint with several different departments simultaneously. She filed with us, with the building department, with fire marshal's office, and even with the county health department, claiming various hazards. It's a shotgun approach. She's harassing him. That's what it looks like to me, and he's not the only one. She's filed similar complaints about 4 other people involved in the recall petition. All of them are obviously bogus, but we still have to investigate each one, I sighed. Do the investigations properly, but document everything. If she's filing false reports, that's actually a misdemeanor under California law, already on it. I'm keeping detailed records of every complaint she files, our investigation process, and the outcomes. The recall election was held on a Saturday at the community center. Turnout was massive, with over 70% of homeowners casting ballots. The results weren't even close. Linda was recalled by a vote of 82%. Patricia and Susan, who hadn't been named in the recall but had been complicit in some of Linda's actions, both chose to resign rather than face their own recall petitions. A new board was elected that same day. David Park became president, Maria Rodriguez became vice president, and a retired attorney named George Chen took on the role of treasurer. Their first official act was to pass a resolution requiring all future enforcement actions to go through a review process before any fines could be assessed. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days after the election, Linda showed up at City Hall and physically tried to force her way into a closed-door budget meeting. Security had to escort her out. She was screaming about corruption and cover-ups, demanding to see files on various city projects. Richard Torres had finally had enough. He filed for a restraining order on behalf of the city. prohibiting Linda from entering City Hall except for legitimate business conducted during normal public hours. The order was granted immediately. That's when Linda made her biggest mistake, apparently deciding that if she couldn't use the system against her enemies, she'd bypass it entirely. She began breaking into properties. David Park called me late one evening, his voice shaking. "Victor, I just got home and found Linda in my backyard. She had a camera and was trying to break into my shed. I called the police. I drove over immediately. 2 Riverside Springs police officers were already on scene, taking statements. Linda was in handcuffs in the back of a patrol car, still ranting about HOA violations and corrupt city officials. Officer Jennifer Walsh came over to brief me. Mr. Park says he found the suspect, Linda Hartwell, attempting to force entry to his storage shed. She claimed she was conducting an HOA inspection. She's not with the HOA anymore," David said. "She was recalled. She has no authority to be here." "That's what I figured," Officer Walsh said. "We're charging her with trespassing and attempted burglary. She'll be transported to county jail for booking." As Linda was driven away, still shouting, David turned to me. "This is insane. How did it get to this point?" "Some people can't accept when they've lost control," I said. "Linda tied her entire identity to being HOA president. Without that power, she doesn't know who she is." The next morning, Linda posted bail and immediately violated the restraining order by showing up at City Hall again. This time she made it all the way to my office before security stopped her. "This is all your fault," she screamed as 2 security officers held her arms. "You destroyed everything. You think you're so smart with your fancy city job, but I know what you did. You manipulated everyone." "Madam, you need to leave immediately," one of the officers said. "You're in violation of a court order." "I don't care. He needs to answer for what he's done." They had to physically carry her out. Richard called the police, and Linda was arrested again, this time for violating the restraining order. The judge set a much higher bail and added GPS monitoring as a condition of release. But Linda still wasn't finished. From her house, unable to physically go to City Hall or the community center, she launched an online campaign. She created a website called Riverside Springs Truth, where she posted wild conspiracy theories about corruption in city government, illegal HOA takeovers, and selective enforcement of laws. She named me specifically, along with David, Maria, Richard Torres, and Marcus Chen. Most of it was so obviously unhinged that nobody took it seriously. But then she started posting personal information, home addresses, phone numbers, even details about family members. It crossed the line from angry ranting into genuine harassment and doxing. David hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit for defamation and harassment. Maria did the same. I spoke with Tom Whitmore about joining the lawsuit, but he advised me to wait since I was a public employee and would have a higher bar to meet for defamation claims. Instead, I focused on documenting everything for the criminal case. Because Linda's behavior had escalated to the point where the district attorney's office was taking notice. The criminal trial for the trespassing and attempted burglary charges was scheduled for 3 months out. But 2 weeks before the trial, Linda made one final, catastrophic decision. She broke into the HOA's community center late at night, bypassing the new locks the board had installed. Security footage showed her entering at 2 in the morning, going straight to the file room, and beginning to pull files and dump them into bags. She also accessed the HOA's computer system and attempted to delete records. The alarm company called David as president, and he immediately called the police. Linda was arrested for the 3rd time, now facing charges of burglary, vandalism, and destruction of records. This time, the DA added additional charges related to her online harassment campaign, including cyberstalking and identity theft, since she had apparently obtained some information by hacking into personal accounts. The evidence was overwhelming. Between security footage, digital forensics on her website, and the HOA's compromised computer system, and the testimony of multiple witnesses about her pattern of behavior, Linda didn't have much of a defense. Her attorney tried to argue that she had suffered a mental breakdown due to the stress of the recall election, but the prosecutor pointed out that her behavior had been escalating for months before that. The pattern showed someone who was willing to break any rule to maintain power and punish those who opposed her. The trial lasted 5 days. I testified about the original HOA dispute and the subsequent harassment. Marcus Chen testified about the false complaints Linda had filed. David Park and Maria Rodriguez described the trespassing incident and online harassment. And IT forensics experts explained how Linda had accessed the HOA's system and what damage she had caused. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts at sentencing, the judge was stern. "Ms. Hartwell, you held a position of trust in your community and abused it repeatedly. When that trust was rightfully revoked, rather than accept the consequences of your actions, you escalated into criminal behavior. You harassed your neighbors, violated court orders, and ultimately broke into properties and destroyed records. Your actions show a complete disregard for the rule of law. Linda was sentenced to 18 months in county jail with 3 years of probation to follow. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the damaged computer system and destroyed records, as well as damages to David Park for his shed lock and security system upgrades he had to install. Additionally, she was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in California and prohibited from contacting any of the people she had harassed, including me, for the duration of her probation. The community of Riverside Springs Estates slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board under David's leadership took a completely different approach. They focused on maintaining common areas and organizing community events rather than nitpicking every minor violation. They revised the covenants to remove vague language and ensure that any enforcement was objective and uniformly applied. Patricia Monroe and Susan Whitley both apologized publicly for their roles in enabling Linda's behavior. Patricia moved out of the neighborhood about 6 months later, saying she needed a fresh start. Susan stayed and actually became an active volunteer for community events, working hard to rebuild her reputation. As for me, I kept my garden gnome right where it had always been. My lawn was maintained at a reasonable length, though I admit I sometimes let it get a bit shaggy just on principle. And every time I pulled into my driveway and saw that cheerful ceramic face, I thought about my mother and how proud she would have been that I stood up for what was right. The case became something of a legend in city government circles. Richard Torres used it as a teaching moment in staff meetings about why we had to be scrupulous in documenting our work and maintaining independence. Marcus Chen framed the thank you letter David Park sent him and hung it in his office. About a year after Linda's sentencing, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Susan Whitley. We had an awkward moment of eye contact before she approached me. "Victor, I want to apologize again," she said. "I should have stood up to Linda much sooner. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I was afraid of becoming her next target." "I understand," I said. "It takes courage to stand up to someone like that, especially when they have power over you. Still, I should have done better. The community is so much healthier now. Last week we had a neighborhood barbecue, and almost every family showed up. That never would have happened under Linda's regime. I'm glad things have improved. They have. And Victor, for what it's worth, your garden gnome is adorable. I can't believe we let Linda make such a big deal about it." I laughed. "It's just a gnome. But it became a symbol of something bigger, it did. Anyway, I won't keep you. I just wanted you to know that I'm grateful for what you did, even if it was uncomfortable at the time." We parted on good terms, and I realized that the whole experience, as stressful as it had been, had ultimately strengthened the community. People were more engaged now, more willing to speak up when something wasn't right. The new HOA board operated transparently and held regular town halls where residents could voice concerns. The lawsuit David and Maria had filed was eventually settled out of court. Linda's homeowner's insurance covered most of the damages, though her rates undoubtedly went through the roof afterward. The website she had created was taken down as part of the settlement, and all the personal information she had posted was scrubbed from the internet as much as possible. Linda served her full sentence and was released on probation. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Arizona after that, living with her daughter and staying far away from any HOA involvement. Her husband, whose construction company had lost several contracts during the scandal, eventually relocated his business as well. The Riverside Springs Estates HOA became a model for how neighborhood associations should operate. They were even featured in a California Association of Realtors publication as an example of good governance. David Park proved to be an excellent president, and when his term was up, Maria Rodriguez took over seamlessly. At work, I used the experience to improve our code enforcement procedures. We implemented additional safeguards to prevent city departments from being weaponized in personal disputes, and created a specific protocol for handling complaints that might be related to HOA conflicts. Marcus Chen actually developed a training program for other California cities on the topic. One evening, about 2 years after everything had settled down, I was sitting on my front porch watching the sunset when David Park walked by with his dog. "Beautiful evening," he called out. "Sure is. How's retirement treating you from the board?" "Great. Maria has everything well in hand. I don't miss the meetings at all." He paused. "You know, I was thinking the other day about how all of this started with a garden gnome and an overly controlling HOA president with a personal grudge. That too. But it's funny how something so small can spiral into something so significant. If you had just paid that fine, none of the rest would have happened." "If I'd paid that fine, Linda would still be terrorizing the neighborhood," I pointed out. "Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it would be easier to just give in." "True. And you know what the real irony is? Your lawn actually looks better now than it did back then." I laughed. "I hired a landscaping service. Turns out when you're not spending all your free time fighting an HOA board, you have money for things like that." "Well, it looks great, and so does the gnome." After he walked on, I sat there for a while longer, thinking about the whole experience. It had been stressful, frustrating, and at times genuinely concerning. But it had also been a reminder of why I got into public service in the first place, to make sure systems worked fairly for everyone, not just for those who happened to hold power. Linda Hartwell had tried to use her position to punish someone she saw as an enemy, not realizing that the very systems she was trying to manipulate had safeguards in place for exactly that reason. Code enforcement reported to me, yes, but that reporting structure existed to ensure professional oversight and accountability, not to create a tool for personal benefit. The whole situation had been a test of whether those systems actually worked. And in the end, they did. Not because I was in a position of authority, but because the rules and procedures were designed to be fair and transparent. Anyone in my situation could have requested a formal hearing, presented evidence of selective enforcement, and challenged an HOA board's decisions. My position had given me knowledge of how the system worked and resources to navigate it effectively. But the system itself was available to everyone. That was the real lesson. When David and Maria and the others saw that it was possible to fight back, they found the courage to do so themselves. The garden gnome, that cheerful ceramic fellow that had started it all, became something of a neighborhood icon. New residents moving in would often hear the story and stop by to see the infamous gnome for themselves. I even caught people taking photos with it occasionally. One family put their own gnome out after moving in, and then another did the same. Within a year, there were gnomes dotting lawns throughout Riverside Springs estates. The new HOA board, with a sense of humor Linda had never possessed, officially declared it gnome-friendly zone and put up a sign at the neighborhood entrance. Tom Whitmore, my attorney, ended up picking up several other clients from the neighborhood for various legal matters. He sent me a fruit basket as a thank you for the referrals, along with a card that said, "Never underestimate the power of lawn ornaments to generate business." Marcus Chen got promoted to Director of Code Enforcement about 18 months after everything concluded. He was excellent in the role, and the department's reputation for fair and professional service only grew stronger. He still jokes that he was promoted because he survived being caught between a deputy city manager and an HOA president and lived to tell the tale. Richard Torres, the city manager, retired last year and was replaced by a woman named Catherine Brennan. During the transition, Richard told her the whole story of the HOA situation as an example of how important it is to maintain professional standards and documentation. Catherine apparently uses it in her orientation sessions with new city employees now. As for me, I'm still deputy city manager, still living in the same house with the same garden gnome on my lawn. I'm more careful now about keeping my professional and personal lives separate, though that's not always possible in a community as tight-knit as Riverside Springs. The experience taught me several important lessons. First, documentation is everything. If I hadn't had Marcus document that code enforcement inspection so thoroughly, Linda might have been able to make her claims of preferential treatment stick. Second, systems and procedures exist for a reason. They seem like bureaucratic red tape until you need them to protect you from someone abusing power. Third, standing up to bullies is exhausting and stressful, but it's worth it, not just for yourself but for everyone else who's being affected. And finally, never underestimate the power of a community to self-correct when given the tools and information to do so. The residents of Riverside Springs Estates didn't need me to save them from Linda Hartwell. They just needed someone to show them that she could be challenged. Once that happened, they took care of the rest themselves. The last I heard about Linda, she was living quietly in Scottsdale, Arizona, working a retail job and staying far away from anything related to property management or community associations. Her daughter apparently monitors her internet use after the whole website incident, which is probably for the best. I hope she learned something from the experience, though I'm not entirely optimistic about that. Some people are so convinced of their own righteousness that they never quite grasp how their actions affected others. But at least she's no longer in a position to exercise power over anyone. The homeowners she targeted have all moved on with their lives. David Park's deck is still going strong, and he hosts neighborhood gatherings there regularly. Maria Rodriguez replanted her grandmother's roses, and they're more beautiful than ever. The new HOA board made it explicitly clear that any plants that predated current residents were grandfathered in, so nobody would face that situation again. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'll walk through the neighborhood and see families outside, kids playing in yards, neighbors chatting across fence lines. It's peaceful in a way it never was during Linda's reign. People aren't constantly looking over their shoulders, worried that some minor imperfection will result in a fine or a nasty notice on their door. That's what an HOA should be, I think. A tool for maintaining the community in positive ways, not a weapon for enforcing conformity and punishing anyone who steps out of line. The new board gets that, and Riverside Springs Estates is better for it. I still have all the documentation from the case filed away in my home office. The photos, the legal letters, the bylaws analysis, all of it. Every so often someone from another HOA community will reach out, having heard the story, asking for advice on dealing with their own problematic board. I'm always happy to share what I learned and point them toward resources. The story has made the rounds in online HOA horror story forums, usually with details distorted or exaggerated. Someone claimed Linda was actually arrested for attempted arson, which never happened. Another version has me somehow orchestrating a conspiracy with city government to frame her, which is absurd. But the core story, about an HOA president who went too far and finally faced consequences, that part is true. Looking back, I'm grateful it ended as well as it did. Things could have gone very differently. If Linda had been slightly more strategic, slightly less obviously vindictive, she might have been able to make more trouble. If the other board members had been fully on her side instead of eventually recognizing the problems, the recall might not have succeeded. If the community hadn't rallied together, Linda might still be in power. But all those things did happen, in the right order, at the right time. Justice prevailed not because of any one person's actions, but because a lot of people did the right thing when it mattered. And my garden gnome? He's still there, smiling cheerfully at everyone who passes by, a small ceramic reminder that sometimes the biggest battles start over the smallest things, and that standing your ground, even over something as simple as a lawn ornament, can make all the difference.